Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 18. The people of the city of Tyre were long known for their pride and lofty thoughts. 1,000 years ago, they had been the leaders of the world, who repainted the inner sea and repaired the banner of civilization in the aftermath of the long dark age that had culminated in the Trojan Wars. Their enterprises delivered countless cities into the world, and the wake of their passing lifted up a second unnumbered host of peoples, which is where various stone-wrought cities of the world came into being for our enjoyment hence. In the time of Alexander, their spirit was crushed and their defences mollified with such success that even today the city walls are low, and the island citadel they relied upon is connected to the land with a causeway so thick that you cannot witness the seas on either flank at once. Alexander became their master, and with his passing then came the Seleucids, who remained pinching at the city's once bottomless treasury for centuries after. Driven low and overtaken by fresh ports built in their image, the city was only of second rank by the time Prince Dion came to set eyes upon it. Yet this was no deterrent to the Ptolemies, who wished to seize the place and its many ships, and had ordered Dion to do as much. This was in the early days of the year 171 prior, and was marked with the slaughter of 1,000 hostages in Hierosolyma to purchase some reprieve from the quasi-siege state the city was subjected to by the Judeans. Leaving his wife and household attendants in charge, and trusting no one more official than this, Dion brought an army of King Ptolemy XII to support a naval thrust into Tyre. Surely this army was not at all dear to Dion, and still he did not see fit to deploy them into the outrageous disaster that he came upon. First of all, while a siege is usually conducted over a long period of time, at Tyre the Ptolemaics had waited only until Dion's banners were visible to begin their assaults. One might attribute this rush to their desire to see no part of the battle's rewards go to Dion's detachment. We can only speculate, for there were no survivors of the day's invaders. Dion saw that Alexandrian ships had come up and were attempting to land their soldiers on a thin stretch of beach on the landward side of the island. This was where various ceremonies to honour the sea were usually conducted by the city, being that it was a spot protected from the weather, and so there is a small gate in the wall here that is hardly fortified. However, when the Ptolemaic ships coursed into the inlet formed between the island, mainland and causeway, they saw not only this weak gate with a gentle beach to land upon, but the city's own fleet tucked up against the causeway, and thousands of soldiers watching this beach with bows and bolt throwers. With the tide that brought them into their attack so swiftly now compelling that it carry on into this moor, the ships were thrown into chaos. Those which landed were bombarded with missiles and hot oils, and all but one of the 10 craft making landfall were set ablaze, with the final one hitting unreasonable sands and becoming lodged in a place too deep to disembark. From all these craft, men threw themselves into the water, only to find that the burning oil was not so afraid of the sea as they, and burned on without relent, while armours and gear longed to sink into the mud and sand. Those ships who had hesitated and remained at a distance were meanwhile set upon by the swift crews of Tyre, whose fresh rowers dug into the water like it was ambrosia, and there was nothing to be done but allow these speeding craft to drive their rams into their targets with explosive force. Since the water was becoming shrouded by the black smoke of the fire attacks, Dion could see no more of the awful fate immersing his allies, and nor did watching any further promise advantage, and so he was away to his previous camp without ever challenging the city. To his surprise, his camp was flanked by a fleet of 10 fighting galleys, 20 wide-berthed assault ships, and lesser craft of logistical purpose. And inside his camp waited Dolon of Alexandria, who was the man placed in command of the campaign. Although in command he might be, it was from Dion that he was to learn of the immolation of his fleet's vanguard. Blaming impudence and politics for the folly, Dolon promised to properly begin the siege the next day. Dion was hesitant, and he asked his famous 11 questions, which are: do you know where they will place their ships tomorrow? Do you know how many men will be able to come to the walls tomorrow? Do you know the movement of the tides and the places of the currents tomorrow? Do you know what each of your captains will do when they see the enemy tomorrow? Do you know what each of your troopers will do when they meet the enemy tomorrow? Do you know the probability of victory and defeat? Do you know the likely rewards and losses in battle? Do you know that there's no objective of worth outside of those walls? Do you know that you can trust me to give you good counsel? Do you know that you cannot trust the gods to give you good counsel? Do you know, able strategos, if the enemy wait in confidence, having already answered such questions? I should like to be hearing your answers before any man hastens to helm it by your word. Most tellings will say that Dolon stormed off without answering, although the records of the day actually say that he attempted to answer most lines of questioning, yet eventually withdrew on the promise that he could provide full answers at a different time. Still, this was the original of the meditative set of questions that Dion would expand on to instruct other generals, and it is generally held by those with experience of military success that Dion was making precisely the correct considerations in his thinking. Dolon must not have wished to admit it, for he carried on with the plan he had boasted of to his king before departing, which was that the city would fall without a siege by clever exploitation of its neglected landward defences. It is astonishing how much thought must have been behind the detection of this weakness and the formulation of the plan, and still the strategy that emerged was so much less effective than simply approaching the enemy in a straightforward manner. So then I will tell you what happened the next day. Dion marched his army back towards Tyre unopposed, shadowed by the fleet at such a distance as to be barely visible. Once Dion arrived, he deployed his army with enough space between himself and the city's causeway that the Tyrians could come and challenge for battle if they wished. Dion's view was that since the beach and vulnerable inlet was now clogged with debris, the city's garrison would not guard that place, and might, in their confidence, come out to prevent a siege by land. This would allow Dolon to come over the horizon and engage the city or army unexpectedly. This was a sound plan, which again produced no material result, since the city's gates remained firmly shut. However, Dolon came up to the coast all the same, and attacked in force via the same approach as the vanguard. The hulls of new vessels clattered against the flotsam and arms left behind by the old, to say nothing of floating cadavers entangled in rope. Even at this sight, Dolon carried on, unafraid of Tartarus or any other machination of the gods, and so doing, he brought himself low by the machinations of men. Dion stood and watched for a second day as Ptolemaic ships crowded a narrow beach and endured hails of arrows and fire. Surprisingly, the result was not as abysmal, for the troops brought to bear were more numerous and better drilled, whereas the Tyrian ships could not intervene with the landing, as the currents were against them. These ships ultimately had to beach themselves on the mainland to avoid capture, whereupon riders and chariots from Dion's army came and routed them in short order. This minor victory was mirrored in the city, as Dolon's troops seized the gate while it was still open and scattered the nearby defenders, taking sections of the walls, but at a cost so immense that the piles of their corpses could be called siege defences in their own right. The city did not surrender as Dolon had hoped, and Dolon himself was killed in his attempts to signal Dion when part of the wall he was stood upon was collapsed by the heat of a burning building at its base. To some degree this achieved his goal, for what clearer signal of the progress he was making could there be? Dion withdrew for a second day, and the city took slaves and loot from what remained of the fleet and its crew to reward their cultivation of enticing weaknesses. This was not the end of the fighting, but Dion quit the scene for the winter, as he faced other battles in Palestine. In particular, he had prompted a large uprising on account of having executed many hostages in Hierosolyma before his departure, a measure designed to buy him some peace that immediately stoked the flames of rebellion further. Dion notes that this was a mistake of his that he regretted, having known and respected some of the leading men of the city who were killed in this stunt. To remedy the mistake, many more would be killed in another crackdown over the coming year, yet this was hardly different to how business had been conducted ever since his arrival, so I shall not dwell upon it as other writers do. The only important point is that the trouble affected Dion's mind and enhanced his desire to learn the secrets of the Judean religion, a path he had muddled through killing so many useful minds. He was diligent in finding out more, and his reports on the so-called Cult of the High Lord remain the best description of what was believed by Hierosolamites in that time. It is from these reports that we know the Judeans could not communicate with Yimo, they believed, if they were to leave certain boundaries, which were established by their ancestors among the Phoenician Canaanites. Experts on this topic have told me that some of their ancestors did not agree with the practice, and rather wished to take their knowledge elsewhere to ensure the survival of their truth. But those people, who founded a city called Kard-Hadasht in Africa, were later slaughtered by the Romans after a bitter struggle that began 3 centuries ago and ended 2 centuries ago. I believe this is where the Romans first came upon the fragments of Manos's truth in the distorted form in which the Judeans kept it. This likely accelerated their interest when the Bosporans came about, but this is all speculation. Dion, through careful and scholarly pursuits, devised a method that would solve many of the problems which Hierosolima was facing. After consulting augurs of Greek gods and interpreting the strange things the Scions of Gold were telling him, he discovered that they could be able to expand the domain of Yimo to cover a much greater area, and thus alleviate the Judeans of the pressure that had kept them in danger for so long. In order to achieve this, he had to temporarily revive the spirit of Yimo, since he knew it truthfully was not present in the world at all, but he did believe, as the Judeans did, that the land he was on bore a connection to the founding deity. Notably, whoever convinced him of this was likely already dead by his own hand. This connection was what he would capitalize upon, for it delivered the chance for him to collect a huge reservoir of magical potential in a place where Yimo's spirit could be easily reached. Since we are speaking here of blood magic, you are likely aware of what this entailed. To begin with, though, there was little blood spilled, as Dion preferred to declare his intention to aid the Judeans, and ask that all who were willing to rejuvenate the Holy Land and bring a visitation of the High Lord upon it heed his orders and be at peace in the city for the time being. This came across like a change of heart, which may have endeared the local people, but it certainly shocked the Ptolemies, who were endlessly paranoid that Dion would join with the Judeans and rebel against them, a profitable road that Dion was not ignorant of, I must add. Their envoys came in gilded processions to extract an answer that pleased them, and Dion was forthright and open about his intentions. Since the Ptolemaic people were confused by the rhetoric of the Scions of Gold, they could not determine if the scheme was advantageous or disadvantageous, or much of what the scheme required. After several rounds of embassies, they realized that Dion's blood magic, while purportedly aimed at reviving a god whom the Ptolemies were not likely to ally with, would require a large quantity of sacrificial materials. Dion was poorly advised that this material should be men, which was not what the Lithosis scholars would prefer. The Scions of Gold who were with him then were of the newer breed, whose proximity to politics had changed their mind on a great many things. The interest of the Ptolemies was that they wished to enact a horrendous revenge upon Tyre for its resistance, and Ptolemy XII was obsessed with acquiring human bones for use in a musical pageant. He was a child of much incest. Therefore, through a pledge to aid in Dion's magic, the generals could carry out such a plan with responsibility for any enmity it fostered being easily deflected to a mad Bosporan with sagacious pretensions. So it was that once again, Dion could be blamed for his evil by some and praised for his genius by others, while he himself wrote nothing that indicated he had very much or very little expectation of success, only that he found his own actions to be proper. The most important thing he did in his negotiations was dictate the strategy of the next attack himself, and so in the autumn of 171 prior, he was able to position his army far from the city and prey upon its many caravans until the army inside came out to challenge for battle. Dion wished to delay the engagement and so offered to negotiate, which was not successful because his eloquence was lacking and his style of speech was dispassionate and hard to follow. After 2 days he was forced to come out of camp and ready for battle, knowing that it was his treaty liege who would benefit, and not himself or his true liege. But his profits were rescued by news that disturbed the Tyrian host. The Ptolemaic fleet was again at the city. This was the ruse Dion had helmed. The garrison began to return to their posts, although this would take several days, and throughout the process they were in the close embrace of Dion's troops, whose dawning zeal was becoming impossible to overcome. Many skirmishes were fought, and when the rival armies both arrived at Tyre, they saw that it was aflame, and that crowds were marching along the causeway to escape to the mainland. Here the spirit of the Tyrians was broken, and they were taken as prisoners by Dion. During this time, the Ptolemaic troops came out from the city and began to slit the throats of all the men, whereas the women or youths too pitiful to slay, they tied up and joined to a train of bondage of the kind used to create slave droves. When Dion came to investigate, he was offered the droves as a gift to aid in his magic, and he accepted it coldly. This business carried on for 2 days, during which time Dion remained camped outside to guard the large stock of slaves he was being given. By the end of the sacking, he had 25,000 slaves in a camp with only 3,000 soldiers, and there was insufficient provisions for the whole host. He had thought to take his prizes to Judea and begin their return to the earth. However, he saw that the Ptolemies returned to their ships and abandoned the smouldering island when their catharsis was achieved. Because of this, he moved the slaves back into their city and closed the gates as if he were the victorious defender, and to some it seemed they had been rescued from the Egyptians by the Bosporan man, although his slaves they remained when the law was to be applied henceforth. In this way he came to personally control more slaves than any other man, and Tyre came to house more slaves than any city save Rome. Yet a mood of citizenship remained, as they began to piece together what remained of their homes and businesses, and Dion encouraged them to work hard at this task. But what of his need for sacrifice for his scheme? After a few days, he instructed his soldiers to gather a tribute by the following method. Any family who still owned a cow or bull was to give it over to him in exchange for his clemency, and for all others, they were to provide blood that would be collected in a series of ink-makers' cauldrons drawn by oxen. These carts were lined outside the city, and the soldiers ensured that everyone came and let blood from their arms fall into the vessel, until tens of thousands of doses were stored. Only the weakest were spared, and otherwise no consideration was given to them, not even for the fact that almost all were women in a state of grief. Wide wooden lids were used to protect the cargo from the sun. The carts were taken to Jerusalem, where the cauldrons were gradually moved into the vaults beneath the High Lord's temple. The city was treated well, by my estimation, and Dion left only 100 men there as a garrison. The city was ingratiated into the Bosporan world, which in material terms allowed them to receive ships and willing suitors from all over the world. This proved essential in their survival through the coming winter and beyond, especially when the continued ire of Ptolemy XII hung over them. In a remarkable development, some years later the city was rapidly regenerated by the coming of a large fleet from the west, crewed by runaways and enemies of the state in Roman Africa, and so people usually say that the Phoenician expeditions that took civilization out to that part of the world now returned and restored the honor of their defiant mother city. It is not possible to know who these people truly were. However, I am willing to accept the story because it well demonstrates the proper order of the world and reminds one of what good their efforts might do for someone else in the distant future. The masterminding Dion was praised by many in King Ptolemy's court, who were now to benefit from commercial access to the city. This not only softened the blow that memory of the king's misadventures might still be at large, but won an overwhelming majority of Alexandria's nobles to Dion's side. No longer was he a foreign liability, but a capable man whose strange methods had demonstrable merit. They began to scheme to thank him for his service in the way that they thought best, and one that their king and their duties to the newly war-ridden state could both be appeased by. The scions of gold were at their ears, their magic now greater than a curiosity. We shall return to this, as this was only the prelude to the Seleucid War. Briefly, I should detail what happened at the same time as the fall of Tyre, under the eye of King Pyrrhosides, who had returned to the far north. Following the trail of allied villages that Aristippus had left in his wake, the king found his way through the darkness of the forests to the place called Casergis. This was where the Marcomanni had built their stronghold, served well by 2 hills guarding a modest river. It was ringed with palisades, which had been reinforced with earthen ramps behind over many decades, so that now there was an unnatural cliff topped with warriors that guarded any approach, or almost any. Let me tell you how this redoubt fell in a single night, and take the chance to contradict many of my peers, for I believe I am the only writer who will tell you the story in the format I am about to present. I do this strange thing because I am aware that no one else has written a true account, and I cannot abide this, because sour truth is not less desirable than sweet fiction for one who would see a golden age come again. When King Parysades had visited Philippopolis and committed his eldest son to war, he had also taken stock of his allies in that region. The Thracians, not under Roman dominion, were naturally under his, and we already know that those who had served the Getae were in this category. Along the eastern coast with the Black Sea is a place called Odrysia, whose peoples were always more sophisticated and independent than the rest of the Thracians, and who spoke Greek extensively. They had been early supporters of Spartacus during his time at Tanais, and had always been keenly interested in what Parysades had found in his expeditions onto the steppe, to the point that these developed tribes were among the first people outside the empire to invite the Scions of Gold to share their message. By the end of the 170s, they were firm adherents to truth and order, and formed an essential piece of the mosaic of allied peoples who shared the Black Sea. A large body of these people had been practicing under the tutelage of a scholar who was hoping to gain entry into the Scions of Gold. This scholar was familiar with the gods and with certain techniques for drawing their attention, which the Getae had practiced since ancient times. The Thracian interpretations of these had come to be improved greatly by modern knowledge, and so the spells at the disposal of this scholar were powerful. Parysades met with this scholar and his followers and was delighted with the dedication he saw. Therefore, he brought a large number of them with him to the front lines at Casergis. The usual tale will say that Parysades trained a Pythikos, a man-like beast from distant Indiki, to surpass the walls of the fortress in the night and cause a ruckus to induce an opening of the gate, after which the action of the night was swift and bloody. This is a mere tavern tale which has been negligently set to tablet in many academies. The truth is that the Odrysian scholar was named Ithikos, which in the rasping fashion of speech found in their towns is easily mistaken for Pythikos. It was Ithikos, then, who disabled Casergis against Parysades, and I have found testimony from a squire to Aristippus that provides some details. Allegedly, Ithikos went to the river that bisects Casergis and waited there until night. He pretended to be drunk to explain his idleness to passers-by. In the middle of the night, Ithikos seized upon a fish that had been entranced by his presence. Lifting it from the water, the fish was interrogated until it revealed the name of the river in the language of the cosmos. Riverine fish are permitted to know these things because they so frequently die that they easily retain memories of cosmic matters they witness in their spiritual transitions. So I have been informed by wild men who look into these mysteries. Ithikos was able to use the name of the river to make a plea to the minor deities who were custodian to the waters there. This is the form of magic the Getae invoked regularly before Parysades came, but it was this Thracian revision of it that saw true understanding. We know this because the river was stopped, its waters waiting in place until Ithikos had directed 1,000 of his followers, richly armoured by the wealth of the Black Sea, to proceed along the river and through its passage under Casergis' walls. Therefore, these men enjoyed a refreshing stroll like one relaxing in a bathhouse, and then merrily opened the gates of the town while still dripping wet. Before alarm was raised, Parysades and his men were already in the full action of an assault. The town was taken during the night, as per the usual telling from here on, but Ithikos made another contribution in the battle's aftermath that can be used to explain certain things. There was unrest among his followers, because Parysades did not credit Ithikos or Odrysian spirit for its role in this overnight victory. In Diotrephes' official account, the assault was serendipitous, and in the account supplied to the archive in Chariskos, we find the story of the beast I mentioned above. Therefore, it is fair to say that Ithikos was overlooked even in the very moment of his triumph, most likely because Pyrrhosides had political concerns in mind, and this was often the case when Aristippus was present. Think not that Pyrrhosides wanted glory for himself, but rather for his son, and so great achievements were better attributed to no one at all than to one who did what his son could not. Regrettably, this petty assessment has convinced me of its veracity in many discussions, whether any like to hear it or not. So, with this being the case, Ithacus and his men sacked the town the next day and made off with great wealth and burned many places in the surrounding countryside. This caused the main army to be deprived of reward for what they had done so far and supplies to enable any further advance. Ithacus went away and deserted the king, but since the Odrysians were not subject to the king's orders at that time, there was no offence committed in this. But their rampage of departure weakened the Bosporan position to the extent that a large amount of the army had to be used to maintain Casergis' integrity, and certainly no further march into the Germanian territories could be made. Furthermore, the battle had not been especially decisive or bloody, resulting in most of the Marcomanni warriors still mingling among the population. They would take what chances they had to slip away to join rogue nobles, and cause the Marcomanni to be less defeated than the fresh paint upon their chief's dining table would suggest. Prince Aristippus was placed in command of the city and given the primary task of quelling rebels and brigands. For this he relied extensively on informants, and was said to have sold his own helmet to help pay for the scarce interpreters this business demanded. I do not wish to give the impression that he was desperate or haphazard. The work of gathering the hired guides in one place and pooling their wisdom into documents for the officers was something that Aristippus excelled at, and I must say that this was not because of any merit on his part. He was someone who generally disliked making conversation, and would use what words he uttered to demean himself or his family to cheaply amuse his company. He knew no better way to do this. However, when he was speaking through interpreters, these hard-working slaves would often say what they thought best, while keeping to the general spirit of what Aristippus had said. Furthermore, Aristippus had a strikingly clean appearance that was instantly respected by any who saw him, and his quiet demeanour gave him a dignified air, at least among those who didn't expect him to say anything important. And so his meetings with foreigners were unusually productive. Contrast this with eloquent speakers who would not dare let interpreters pass on anything other than the most precise rendition of their sayings, and hence would lose the value of local knowledge, customs, and idioms that interpreters are usually able to supply. To summarize, Aristippus proved an able administrator among unfamiliar people, if only by virtue of his lack of familiarity even with his own kin. If he can really be credited for this is debatable, so let us move on. Pyrrhosides had been seeking battle by investigating strategic places where warriors might be concealed. There were too many of these to count, let alone map, showing the danger of any force that hoped to dominate these blood-borne forests and hills. He was rescued from his Sisyphean work when Aristippus came to know the full details of the enemy's plans. The Marcomanni were mustering among the supposedly allied villages to the south, so that they could cut the Bosporans off from their line of supply to Pannonia. These cunning methods were well known to the Germanians, as were the practices of pretending to submit to invaders and reneging at the earliest opportunity. The only thing that prevented an enormous army from gathering was the stunning speed at which Pyrrhosides arrived, travelling lightly with the expectation of taking the enemy's camp to replenish his horsemen's saddlebags. This was made more impressive by the weather. It was winter, and snow fell every day. As I have said, Pyrrhosides' army still had many Lithoses who had been raised and trained in the World's End forests, where the conditions were not much different to those on this campaign. Thus the Marcomanni found their forests and sky to be incompetent shield-bearers. It was the dead of night when the killing blow came. Having located the Marcomanni, Pyrrhosides endeavoured to rush for a day and a half without rest, so that his riders suddenly appeared on a ridge flanking the camp. His tired force was brought to life by the brilliance of a full moon that set the snowfields aglow when it rose at their backs, making shades of their men and horses to those sentries chancing a look at the ridge from below. Diotrephes asked Pyrrhosides if, in the hurry of arriving here, he had taken the omens of battle. Pairicedes said firmly that the omens were to be made by men, and repeated as much to his soldiers during a brief inspection of their disposition. If you think that was a careless attitude, then mayhap you will see the result of the battle as evidence to the contrary. The herd came down the side of the ridge all at once, making able use of the snow to soften and ease the descent, while the Marcomanni, roused from their sleep, were made to come out with whatever gear and organization could be found at a moment's notice, where the snow slowed them and rooted them in the path of the king's avalanche. The effect of the Bosporan arrows was doubled by the casting of blood about the snow, shocking those not yet hit with the colourful violence of their imminent fate set against the silver world of that ghost-graced night. All drums and howls seemed too haunting to bear, and although in truth the Bosporan horses became mired and weak in the snow at the ridge's base, their sweeping arrival had prompted the camp to be torn apart from the inside by fleeing rebels. This camp was taken with its stores intact, and so the peril the Bosporans were actually in was removed. Diotrephes made the camp his own, while the king went and hunted the scattered rebels. Because none of these terrified warriors was willing to admit to being an officer or leader, the king saw fit to kill all he caught rather than make slaves of them, where their spirit might be restored and malicious schemes returned to their kit. He was not wholly successful because his horses and riders were in need of rest, and so the last of the long night was spent in the Marcomanni camp. Several thousand warriors were killed, and an amount of war materials and supplies beyond counting was secured. First, Pairicedes had all he had taken loaded into wagons and brought to Casergis. There, he performed a theatrical parade through the town, his men acting out scenes of the recent battle, using genuine pieces of rebel gear as their props, bloodstains carefully preserved, or further emphasized. And when it was asked what became of the rebels, and why this procession showed no slaves, which was usual for these kinds of victory parades, Pairicedes revealed that he had tailed his show with a large group of children, each carrying a bowl of soil. The meaning of this was that the children were now unparented aside from the earth itself, and indeed this gang was sourced during Pairicedes' return by collecting fatherless children from the villages and seizing them away. This was a mild penalty for their rebellion in comparison to what other parts of Europe were seeing under the Romans. This was a clever move, for it created a piercing impression of power and simultaneously a show of kingly warmth and stewardship. It was a political strategy more than a show of virtue, though, for in bringing these children to Casergis, there would be more Germanians who lived and worked close to the Bosporan administration, and fewer in the endless seas of uncharitable forests. Thus Aristippus, who was to represent the king and kingliness in all the ways the Scions of Gold demanded, was given thousands of children to employ in the city. This was a task akin to keeping a flock of chickens, and Diotrephes noted upon his departure that he thought the children might make their escape and be killed by their own kin for their apparent submission. He was too cynical, we can say now, for Aristippus took to the task well, and as a good farmer makes coops and fences to manage his fowl, he added new halls to Casergis where the children might be all parented at once by chosen matrons. As for their likelihood of escape, there is no doubt that many did take that chance, and their fate falls beyond our view. But it was not as if the new halls were ever emptied, and those that stayed are said to have been amused by Aristippus coming and attempting to speak with them in the local language. Here he was not aided by tactful interpreters, rather by the fact his strange way of conducting a conversation was very suitable to the minds of children, and they came to associate the foreigners who had conquered them with a certain kind of delightful intrigue. Or at least there were those who attested as much in later life, and it can be argued that the circumstances of the town in later years affected the way those growing up in those times would speak about the Spartakids. Since this is a minor matter, it remains on the frontiers of our study for the time being. So then we shall attend to major matters in place of that, only imagining what imitations of socialization Prince Aristippus underwent in his tenure on that far frontier. The true business of the time was what the king swiftly returned to Apollon to seek news on. News I shall deliver even more comprehensively unto you next. The Seleucid Empire was awoken at last, to scenes of blood and gold.